Mesdames, Messieurs, bonjour de Paris, ladies and gentlemen, good morning from Paris. It's my privilege and my pleasure to open this seminar of the Franco-Austrian Center for Rapprochement in Europe on the present and future relations between the European Union and China. Of course, it's today important to describe the world we live in, let's say 2 or 3 decades. But sure, we know that it will be very different of ours, that it will probably have a totally new international structure, and that China, positively or negatively, right or wrong, will there have in this world a decisive weight. One of the main problems of this world to come will be the organization of globalization. Until now, this globalization has been organized or disorganized or ill-organized around Western principles. This time is over, and of course, the present year with the COVID crisis will no doubt accelerate this change. To organize this new form of globalization, China has its own proposal, the Belt and Road Initiative, integrating all its strategic means, which is an economic, a political, a geopolitical project for Chinese environment, but more broadly concerning the entire world. Confronted to this proposal, to this program, Europeans have been first hesitant and somewhat divided. More recently, the European Union and some member states have produced new analysis, new proposals for connectivity between Europe and Asia, or for the creation of an Indo-Pacific area of stability and cooperation. Anyway, it's clear that the future organization of globalization, in every hypothesis, should it be a globalization dominated by China or an opposition between various areas following specific logics or whatever, the future organization of globalization will widely depend on the strategies of the present strategies of the dominant actors of the international relations, China, the US, Japan, India, Russia, and of course, Europe. It's why our debate is so important. We have to defend our interest, our identity as Europeans. We have doing that to define our proper status in this new world. Until now, in this fundamental debate, it was better to speak of the Europeans. Let's hope that very soon it will be more convenient to speak of simply Europe. I would like to thank for the organization of this seminar, the CFA team in Vienna, and our colleagues of the Konrad Adenauer Stiftung or Foundation, Multilateral Dialogue in Vienna. I would like to thank also all the participants of this seminar today and to wish you a very fruitful debate. And I would like to ask to Claudia CRAWFORD, director of this multilateral dialogue, sorry for the pronunciation, for the Konrad Adenauer Stiftung, to take the floor and open again this seminar. Thank you very much. Claudia, you have the floor.
Thank you, Dominique, and good morning to everybody. On behalf of the Konrad Adenauer Stiftung, I would like to welcome all participants to our virtual conference today. At this point, I would also like to thank the 2 event partners, the EFZ and Ifri, for our cooperation. Why is the Konrad Adenauer Stiftung participating in this discussion? We have been working in China for a long time. We have 2 local offices, and we also have our own China expertise at our Berlin location. The reason for our interest on China is obvious. China not only plays a major role economically, and indeed for Germany and many other EU countries, but also globally and geopolitically, as Mr. Dominique rightly said. In our view of China, perspectives have shifted, I think. I think we've lost a number of certainties. Among other things, prosperity and greater economic openness are accompanied by political changes. It was expectation that the political system of China, with increasing economic integration with the West, would become more Western itself. But so far, there can be no question of that. Rather, we have to ask ourselves to what extent China is successfully bringing its own political model into the world and applying it, for example, in multilateral organizations. In our program text for today's conference, the EU-China Strategic Outlook from March 2019 is quoted. I quote, "China is a strategic partner, but also a competitor and strategic rival of the EU. For the Konrad Adenauer Stiftung, it is important that the EU member states agree on what this means in concrete terms for the EU's policy towards China. And I hope that our discussion today will contribute to this understanding. So I'm looking forward to the discussions and thank our speakers or moderators for joining us today.
Thank you very much, Claudia. Thank you, Dominique, for your introductory remarks. Let me just add a few words before I hand over to the first panel. I think the setting is very clear. Dominique, you put the focus on the shifting environment for globalization. And Claudia, you mentioned also the strategic outlook, which, as you rightly said, defines China for the first time as a partner, competitor, and a strategic rival. We were supposed to have also for the first time a summit meeting between the 27 heads of state and government with President Xi Jinping in Leipzig under the German presidency of the Council. This became a victim of the COVID crisis and was replaced by a video call, as we know. We were also supposed, and this would also have been a meeting of the 27 heads of state and government on China in November, precisely to discuss how the European Union should get its act together to respond to the challenge China is posing. Now that again had to be postponed for the reasons we all know, but I still think that the seminar we have today covering the broad range of the relationship of the European Union with China, setting out the challenges and trying to come up with some of the responses, will make an input into an informed discussion on how to deal with China in the future. And with that, I would simply mention a few housekeeping remarks. We have two panels, 75 minutes each. In between, we have a short break of 15 minutes. We have not only two very distinguished panels, but we have also two very distinguished and excellent moderators. The first panel will be chaired by Christine G. Kupfer, who has been for a long time with Merix in Berlin, where she is still a senior fellow, but she has also recently been appointed to a professorship at the Institute of Sinology at the University of Trier. And the second panel will be chaired by Ambassador Fiegel, who was the deputy head of mission in Beijing for quite a while before coming back to Vienna, where she's heading the China Task Force. We will also have an opportunity for Q&A, and I would like to ask the audience to register their questions they have to the panel in the Q&A panel, where they can either address it simply to the panel or to a specific panelist. And with that, I would like to hand over to Christine, who will also introduce the panelists and organize the discussion. Thank you very much again for joining us, and I would also like to add my thanks to Ifri, to the Konrad Adenauer Stiftung, and also to the Vienna Institute for International Economic Studies, which has also joined us as a supporting partner. Thank you very much.
Thank you very much, Dietmar. Good morning. Also from my side, it's a pleasure and an honor to be able to chair the first panel with a truly European list of participants from 4 different countries. We also do have a very distinguished audience. I was just glancing through some of the names. So as Dietmar said, we will have the opportunity to also engage all of you in the discussion, reacting to what the panelists will say. We will talk about engaging with China and while preserving or defending, as Dominique said, European values and interests in various fields. And I'm personally glad to see that we kind of see values and interests mentioned together here, because I think that's oftentimes kind of try to be separated, but I do think it's important to discuss that together. Of course, Dominique already mentioned that we do have a discussion also within Europe. What are European values and interests? And we do have some agreement, but also some disagreement. And also, of course, we have to manage our relationship with China amidst the situation that our transatlantic relationship is also not at the very best currently. And also there's some doubts and discussions whether we still share some common interests and values. We do have a super diverse and excellent panel, and I will briefly introduce the panelists first, all of them, and then we agreed to have a introductory remark, a statement limited to 5 minutes of each of the panelists, and I will gently remind the panelists via the chat and also by probably then giving you some audio signal when you're approaching the end, and then we will engage into a discussion with the panelists, and then finally, as Dietmar said, also give you some time, the distinguished audience, to interact. As I said, we do have a truly European panel. We first have Helena KOENIG. She's the Deputy Director General at DG Trade. And she has deep roots in Europe and in the EU. She has been previously also with DG Relax. As I heard, it's probably not a relaxing job though, but DG Relax, the Department for External Relations. So not only from the trade side, but also from the overall external relations side, she brings a lot of insights. Great to have you, Helena. We do have Reinhard Bittekofer. He's the chair of the EP delegation for relations with the PRC, a long-standing member of the European Parliament of the Green Party. And he's not only a knowledgeable European, but also very outspoken and very analytical, sharp-pointed when it comes to relations, not only with China, but first and foremost with China. Great also to have you, Reinhard, with us. And then we have Alice Ekman. Alice is a senior analyst with the European Institute for Security Studies in Paris. And Alice has a long history looking into foreign policy and security developments, not only in regard to China, in the whole of Asia. So she can also bring the expertise from putting China relations in a regional perspective. Also great to have you with us, Alice. And then last but not least, we do have Martin Haller, who is a sinologist and the director of synopsis.cz. If you haven't had a chance to look at the platform, please do so. They do great work when it comes to portraying and analyzing China's impact on the outside world with a specific Czech perspective, but not limited to the Eastern European angle, but also great to have you with us, Martin. And I would call on Helena, to give us your first introductory remarks. Please feel free to be provocative to stimulate the discussion, and please limit your statement to 5 minutes. Helena, thank you very much. The floor is yours.
Thank you very much, Christine. And I can assure you nothing about dealing with China is relaxing from a work perspective. And just, of course, recapping a bit of the last years, we all know that we've seen a rise in unilateralism. We've seen a rise in economic nationalism. We see a multilateral rules-based order and global governance, which is severely weakened. Not the least in the World Trade Organization, WTO, which is in a deep crisis and even a risk for demise as we go forward. So then let's enter China in the equation. We have a China which has grown to have an economy which is as big as the EU, so the US, But at the same time, it has a state-driven economic system and policies, which is causing disruption on the global market and also in the EU market. We have a China which is opening, but not opening quick enough to address the imbalance between these systems and markets, and that is creating a lot of frictions. At the same time, we have a China which is very much an essential partner for the EU. It's an essential partner when it comes to climate, for obvious reasons. It's an essential partner when it comes to the WTO, as we'll go forward and look to have a sustainable reform ongoing. And it's a global essential partner when it comes to fighting pandemics, as we know from the current situation. Research one area, but of course other areas of cooperations too. At the same time, as you mentioned earlier, it's a competitor. It's a country which moves up on the high-tech scale of exports, supported very much by state policies and state funding, which again also creates an issue, of course. So against this backdrop, what is it the EU is thinking that we need to do? I think the basis for it is that we still want to have an open EU. We want an open EU because it's good for us. At the same time, we have to take care of our own interest also because of the disruption that the entry of China, but also other economies, have created on the European market. So we need to pursue our interest, but not in isolation, together with others also. We need to build resilience, competitiveness, and growth as we go forward. So what do we want to do? How do we want to do that? We want to lead and shape the global economic governance system, i.e. getting the WTO back on track, but also other parts of global governance. We want to have mutually beneficial bilateral relationship, and that is, of course, China, but also other countries. And we also need to take the necessary measures to strengthen our own economy and defend it from unfair practices or practices that creates havoc in our market. So it's about striking the balance between an EU which is open for business and an EU which protects its people and companies. So the key components of that is multilateral reform, WTO, of course, at the core for anyone who deals with trade, which is about getting US back into believing in the system and feeling that the system is beneficial for them and for everyone else, and to get China fully engaged in the reform work which is necessary to reach that point. We also need a good bilateral relationship with China. We're trying to, as I mentioned, rebalance our economic openness, if I put it that way. One of the key issues are the investment negotiations, which tackle rules, for example, on SOEs, it tackles tech transfer rules, and it tackles subsidies in the form of transparency. We also need to discuss with China industrial overcapacity, whether it's steel and aluminium, or indeed other sectors which are supported by the Made in China 2025. Third point, as I said, is putting our own house in order. We have been coming up with proposals on a 5G toolbox linked to cybersecurity. We have a new policy for investment screening, which just entered into force this month, which is very much linked to security and public order. We are looking at ongoing work on the modernization of our export control regime. And we also have a set of initiatives that are really there to address distortions on the market, mainly the EU internal market, but also distortions that may reach outside the EU market. So we've come out with a white paper on foreign subsidies, which will be further developed into measures, initiatives next year. We have produced guidance documents on public procurement, i.e. how do you deal with bids that may be abnormally low, i.e. potentially subsidized by another country. We have also looked at our trade defense instrument, strengthened those, and we've looked at the international procurement instrument. Again, very much of this is pushed by subsidization. I'll just finish with one thing, and I'm happy that you said you would gently say when we're kind of running to the end of the time. It sounded more drastic in the email. I would just like to come back to something Claudia said in the beginning. A key thing for this is we have a common vision between EU member states on how we bring the EU-China relationship forward, and that's based on a common analysis, and then rolling it out and keeping a tight messaging from all 27 of us. Thank you.
Thank you so much, Helena, also keeping to the time. And I think indeed what you just said to share, to make sure that we share this view across Europe is also crucial for this balancing act you just mentioned, in keeping Europe open, but also taking the necessary precautious measures to be able to defend our interests and values. Thank you so much, Helena. I would turn it then over to Reinhard Bütikofer for his introductory remarks. Reinhard, the floor is yours.
Thank you, Christine, and thanks to Adenauer Stiftung, CFA, and Ifri for having me on this panel. I would like to start by stating what may not be obvious to everybody, but I strongly sense that on China, Europeans have not been as united as we are now for many years. We're coming together. It's easier to say us at the moment. That is for two reasons mainly. On one hand, China is pushing so hard, they're overreaching with their aggressive policies, forcing us to recognize that what they do to Sweden today, or to the Czech Senate president the day before, or to the German automotive industry tomorrow, is the same kind of experience that they have in store for all of Europe. These special China relations that have prevented Europe from coming together in the past have waned. I would argue that Germany is becoming more European as regards the China relations because Chinese nationalist economic strategies are trying to eat the German high-tech lunch. And the easy accommodation that we had in the past is not there it's not there to stay. We provided high-tech products and luxury cars to China, but they're now moving up through the value chain, and their Made in China 2025 strategy 5 years ago proved a turning point in the understanding of what the relationship will be in the future. So Germany is becoming more European, and at the same time, the 17+1 special outfit that China fostered to divide and conquer has proven to be an empty bag, and many of the participants are quite disappointed. So Europe has a better chance of staying together and acting together. The strategic outlook has already been mentioned. Of all the different definitions that are given there for our relationship to China, I believe the one about strategic rivalry is the most important element, because you can cooperate if you're strategic rivals. You can also compete, but you can never forget that you are strategic rivals. You are not strategic rivals on Monday, and for the rest of the week, you just pursue win-win options. That's not possible. So I think everything has to be seen under the perspective of this systemic rivalry. That does explicitly not exclude cooperation if we can make it happen. I believe that if you take on a competitor, you have to understand your competitor, yourself, and the environment. And when we look at ourselves, as Helena has already pointed out, Europe has made several steps forward with regard to investment screening and other measures. We're still wanting in some dimensions. So for instance, Berlin is still blocking the international procurement instrument, unfortunately, but we're making headway. We're not making as much headway with reforming our own capacity to be more competitive. I think it will be very interesting to compare the figures about research and development in the 15th five-year plan to be announced shortly, and the figures in the EU's Horizon Europe a 5-year or 7-year plan. I think that will be an unfortunate awakening for us. And in that regard, we cannot just insist playing defense. We'll also have to develop our own capacities, and there we're not where we should be. As regards China, I think it is becoming obvious that they're not just trying to be an important player. They want to change the rules of the game. China is trying to supersede the Western geoeconomic rationale with its own geopolitical rationale. And at the core, I would say the foreign policy that China pursues is defined by an imperial logic. And China is trying to reform the international governance system, turning what used to be a multilateral approach into a hub and spokes kind of setup with, with China and Beijing as the center. I think we, and this is my last sentence, we will only be able to counter that if we don't just rely on our own capacities, but also team up with others, in particular also with the United States, even if that is difficult. Thank you.
Thank you very much also, Rainer, to keeping to the time frame. And you, like Helena already mentioned, the US, which will be obviously a crucial factor besides European unity to manage our relationships with China. And you're very clear the strategic rivalry in your view is the dominant framework that we should be thinking about how to shape and to move forward also, as Helena said, with additional steps to protect our interests and values. Thank you very much. And without further ado, I turn it over to Alice Ekman. Alice, the floor is yours.
Thank you very much, Christine. Do you hear me well? Yes, perfect. So thanks to you, thanks to Ifri, to CFA, to CAS for the invitation. As I have 5 minutes, I would like to share with you 7 points that, in my opinion, we have to take into consideration when engaging with China, the China of Xi Jinping, and it's very much Xi Jinping's foreign policy and domestic orientation that I would like to take into account here. The first point, very clearly, is I think we should not underestimate China's innovation capabilities. Research and development capabilities, but innovation capabilities. As you remember, in most EU member states, even 5 years ago, even more so 10 years ago, there was this general hypothesis that basically due to the political system, China would not be able to fully innovate, it would just be copy-paste. And as a matter of fact, we should not be too worried about technology transfer, etc., etc. This has proven to be wrong and not in our interest. And more than ever, I think we should fully take into account China's ambition in terms of research and development, and most of all, China's ambition in terms of technological autonomy, especially in the COVID and post-COVID context. Openly, Xi Jinping is mentioning the need to focus on technological development on its territory, but also China has clear ambition to export technologies abroad, and it's already doing so in some countries who are not altered by the debate on 5G as much as we are concerned about the issue in Europe or also in the US. So this is a prerequisite, but I think more than ever, it's important to keep it in mind and to put on the side this hypothesis that China is not able to innovate at this point in time, really. Second point I would like to underline, we should not underestimate, in my opinion, the very rude, very tough, let's say tough competition between political systems that has emerged and that will continue to unfold as long as President Xi Jinping is in power. I would like to mention this because in my opinion, it's independent of the result of the upcoming presidential election. I'm not saying that the election will not have an impact on this, but this competition has started well before Trump arrived to power. Already in 2013, in front of the Central Committee, Xi Jinping was mentioning the superiority of socialism over capitalism and the ultimate victory of China's political system over others in recent occasion publicly. And China is calling for the fourth confidence or for self-confidence, confidence in China's past, in China's theory, in China's system, and China's culture. So whatever happened, being COVID-19, being other crises, being other events, China will try to project an image of confidence, and will try to also, in contrast, underline the so-called limits or failure of other political systems, and this independently of the results of the presidential election. So I think this is important to keep in mind. Third point I would like to underline is a point that Reinhard mentioned, so I will be very brief, is China's ambition to reform and restructure global governance. This is obvious. It's actually, it started well before Xi Jinping's mandate, already under Hu Jintao. And again, we underestimated the ability of China to fully integrate into this system. Because already we were saying, well, you know, China will not be able to gather countries around its position. Well, this is a matter of debate today. When you look at the issue of Xinjiang or Hong Kong, yes, there is a group of countries who stand up to voice its concern about the situation in the region, but China is also trying as much as possible to, as Xi Jinping is mentioning, enlarge its circle of friends, meaning gather a coalition of countries to support its position on the most sensitive issue. And this will continue. It will not be easy for China, but will continue as much as possible in the coming years, independently of the results of the presidential election and the evolution of the COVID-19 crisis. Fourth point is one that Dominique David mentioned in the introduction, is globalization restructuring. This is very important. 2 years ago, the Belt and Road was redefined as a new project or alternative form of globalization. And this is pretty clear when you look at China's investment in logistic hub, being smart ports, smart airports, train station, and also the willingness to better be able to manage the flows being of goods, of person, of data, at a time where China is, as Reinhard mentioned, is hoping to be at the center of this flow management. Fifth point, sorry, it's a bit list, but I try to be efficient, is the definition gap, very important. China more than ever has, it has been in multilateral form kind of adapting, and I would not say softening, but adjusting its foreign policy discourse. So to use words that we traditionally use: human rights, rule of law, globalization, multilateralism, free trade, internet, journalism, all these words basically have now double meaning, and China hopes to promote an alternative definition of these keywords in international forum, with the ambition to convert this word as reference definition. And this is important here because it's also related to the second point I was mentioning of related to the competition between political systems, which is also a normative and lexical competition that has direct consequences when negotiating with China. Okay, Christine, so I go quickly because I just saw your note. 6 points. China has a pattern-based diplomacy. It's very centralized, as you know. I'm not teaching that to policymakers around me, you know that better than I do. But when there is a keyword that has been adopted by central level, it's in that case copy-pasted and repeated and replicated towards many EU member states, towards the EU. So for example, when we talk about tripartite cooperation or trilateral cooperation with Africa, this has already been proposed to France, to Spain, to Brazil, with different targets. For example, to Portugal, it was presented for cooperation with Portuguese-speaking countries in Africa. To Spain, it was a format of cooperation not in Africa, but with Latin American countries. I mean, all this to say that this pattern base is sometimes an asset for China, but it's also a weakness in the sense that increasingly China diplomacy is predictable, but also for EU member states, if they coordinate well, they can anticipate this pattern and also learn lesson. What is to learn positively or negatively for when it comes to trilateral cooperation with Africa, and how the EU should deal with this kind of framework proposed partly by China, so that it's in its arrest. And last point, I will conclude here, is that, yeah, well, given the 6 points previously mentioned, I think it will be very difficult to engage in the normative, in the theoretical, in the conceptual field, because China is very determined. Doesn't mean that you should not be active in the field, but I think when it comes to cooperation with China, the focus should be on a very, very specific, detailed issue. That's already the path that has been taken. For example, when negotiating the agreement on geographical indicator, it has not been easy, but it has been efficient. And I think a very specific issue like this should be the focus of EU-China negotiation and cooperation. And I'm thinking also about the protection of EU citizens and businesses on the Chinese territory. I unfortunately anticipate that this will be an emerging, it's more and more important issue to at the top of the agenda. Some of European actors being trapped into the broader context of US-China rivalry and detained in China in the future. I will stop on this pessimistic note, sorry.
Thank you very much, Alice. I do think it's important to be realistic, and you showed us impressively how to also strengthen our capacities to unpack China's ambitions, language-wise, infrastructure-wise, also things that Helena and Reinhard has mentioned before, but to be realistic what we are facing and not to be naive as people have been observing and discussing. Europe has been for too long. Thinking that trade eventually will lead to opening up of China and a change of the Chinese political system also. So thank you very much for this realistic, I would call it, remarks. Martin, I would like to turn the floor to you to give us your introductory statement. Thank you very much.
Thanks so much, and thanks for having me on this panel. Thanks, Christine, also for the good words about our project synopsis. 5 minutes is a short time, so I'll just make a few general remarks. I think I would be stating the obvious if I say that there has been a huge asymmetry between the European Union and the People's Republic of China in the way they approach each other. This asymmetry has built up over the last 20 years when the EU and the West in general, we can say, based their policies towards China on the wrong assumptions. These assumptions, in my opinion, have crystallized during the MFN debates in the United States in the latter half of the 90s, and then globally with China's entry into the WTO at the beginning of the millennium. In terms of policy, they manifested themselves as the engagement in the United States and in various local variations of this policy in Europe, like the change through trade in Germany. In the region where I live, in Central and Eastern Europe, the region was a little late by about a decade in adopting these engagement policies, but then applied them with vengeance, as is perhaps best expressed in the 16+1, or rather 17+1 initiative that's already been mentioned by Reinhard. The gist of these assumptions in Europe was that by adopting certain market reforms and other elements borrowed from democratic capitalism, the PRC somehow ceased to be a Leninist state. It was, of course, always duly noted that it is a one-party political system, but through all these years, it was expected that the economic opening and the engagement with the West would automatically lead to a quote-unquote convergence with the liberal democratic order prevailing after 1989. The political system within the PRC didn't matter. It was considered just a local idiosyncrasy that would by default have to follow the general logic of the history or the long arch of history towards the liberal order, which was understood as the pinnacle or indeed the end of history for a long time. Essentially, I would say the West applied its own wishful thinking on a political system that never ceased to be Leninist in substance and has always been guided by its own logic. And the net result was that in the last 2 decades, the West employed, I would say, inefficient and indeed naive, often naive policies towards the PRC, while the PRC implemented very effective techniques to benefit from the open European system, all the while without having to reciprocate much themselves. So I also argue that this has led to the stretching of the international order to the point when we can see the institutional basis of the post-war system on the verge of breaking down. Major institutions are affected, from the United Nations itself to the WHO and indeed the WTO, the World Trade Organization. In parallel, the PRC is building its own initiatives like the BRI or pseudo-regional groupings like the 17+1. In response, in the West, new concepts and institutions seem to be coming up, like the Indo-Pacific, the Quad, and others. But so far, they seem to be rather ad hoc, as though trying to catch up for the 2 decades of lost time. A new comprehensive framework to deal with China is yet to emerge. And I think it can only materialize if we cast away our illusions and wishful thinking and start to look at the PRC through its own logic to understand its aims. And then after a careful analysis, develop a proper response. Thanks.
Thank you very much, Martin. Also keeping exactly to the time frame and also reminding us, as your professors have done, to look at China the way to understand their own logic, to see their own ambitions, and not being guided by this, as you mentioned, the convergence, so to say, belief that was present in Europe, at least for some time. But as you all mentioned, that it seems that the European Union is moving forward. There seems to be this momentum also by shared experiences. I mean, in Eastern Europe, but also Reinhard mentioned probably across Europe more and more that what China does to one country has an effect or can be replicated then also in other European countries. So there seems to be really, that has been very clear, I think, from all of your statements. Once again, thank you for this, that there is this momentum, there has been some progress. Now is the time, obviously, to move forward on specific issues. There's quite a lot in the pipeline, which is sometimes, as Reinhard mentioned, blocked also by individual countries. But we do have concrete steps to pursue in that sense. We know what can be done. My first question, which I would like to address to Helena to start with, but then also would invite the other panelists to react to, would be then looking to the US, because I know that at least in the scientific or the think tank field, that there is a debate that a European approach on the one hand should be suitable to what Europe or the EU is in terms of its own political culture. On the other hand, also seeing that to some regard, the US more obviously much more aggressive approach to some of the issues that the US is facing vis-a-vis China is considered by some observers to be more successful because of the pressure that the US is, of course, also by its own weight, obviously, to be able to put on China. But I would like to ask you, Helena, looking at the EU and looking at the measures which are kind of lined up, is there anything you would say the EU could learn from the way Washington is managing its relationships with China? And we could kind of take on to also give more dynamic to the current momentum that you all seem to have, seem to sense in the way Europe is dealing with China. Thank you.
Thank you, Christine. Well, I wouldn't classify it necessarily as learn, but I think the fact when we saw the US acting as it did vis-a-vis China, obviously there are concerns because we are definitely constrained by our big belief in having a rules-based system and following the rules. And there is some discrepancy whether we actually feel that the US are following the rules, as I think everyone knows. But I think one important part is to say that we always had a very similar analysis of what was happening and what that would mean for our economies with the US. since many years, actually. And it wasn't because we cooperated so well together, but when we met, it was obvious that there was a strong basis. And that, I think, what happened between the US and China actually triggered very much the 2019 communication, a sense that we have to be more robust and we have to get our house in order. So from that aspect, I think it was very good and very welcome. Because suddenly we started looking at what is it that we need to build up on our internal market and how much more robust can we be vis-a-vis China. And if you look at the language in the 2019 communication and the language which has come out in meetings after that, it is a sea change. I mean, it's definitely, we're putting our interest in the forefront and really trying to explain on the highest level why the current situation is untenable for us. And it's very much like Reinhold said in the beginning, you can be a competitor and cooperate. And that's kind of the situation we really would like to come to, for China to realize that something has to be done. Is there more things that need to be done? Yes, probably. But I think one of the key aspects where we are now and where we've differed from the US is really to say that if we want to change the multilateral rules-based order, which we still are convinced is the best way to do this, we have to have China in there. And whether that means more pressure from the US and the Europe together to get where we know that we have to go and where China has to go, then I do think, like most other speakers have said, we need to cooperate. But I would also add that it's not only US we need to cooperate with, we also need to cooperate with others. Because this is a common problem. It's not only the EU-US as the big markets, but it's actually very widespread. And that's something I realized when I've been in the previous period when I was actually traveling around quite a lot. It's how big the worry is of what policies from China, but also from other countries sometimes, but from China very much are doing to other countries' markets. So there is a concern which is shared, and therefore we should work a lot more together with many.
Thank you very much, Helena. I mean, the like-minded partners, I think that all of you, Reinhard for sure, and also Martin referred to, like Australia, obviously, South Korea, but any kind of markets which struggle obviously with the same kind of challenges facing Chinese and sometimes, of course, also US behavior when it comes to multilateral rules and regulations. Helena, you've just mentioned something that I also wanted to bring up to and asking that question to Reinhard, and it's also a question actually from the audience. To what extent do we also have to take into account that there might be pressure within China from their own structural challenges to act in a more aggressive or more assertive way? On the other hand, also, of course, taking into consideration that China may also face increasing challenges and may be more vulnerable to also pressures or coordinated measures from the EU. So, Reinhard, I would like to follow up on that question here from the audience also. To what extent do we have to take into account as an accelerating factor or also as an opportunity China's own internal challenges? May or may this not lead to a more assertive or also to a more benign behavior of China, a return to a collective, more rational leadership in the face of the current challenges Beijing is facing?
Thank you for the question, Christine. There are certainly internal pressures. The discourse within China has been transformed. I think you did a study at NEREX a while ago in which you analyzed the different ideological or constituencies with different world outlooks and came to the conclusion that the liberal crowd have been basically marginalized and isolated, and all the other lines of thinking are imbued with some degree of nationalism. And this has been used by the party leadership that they are under pressure the population to be more aggressive externally than they would like to be, I would not sign on to that statement, because we've seen so many examples where the leadership opened the pipeline or closed the pipeline according to what they thought would benefit them. So I would discard this notion that there are specific pressure points where they can't compromise because of internal controversy, but certainly the overall transformation of the thinking is relevant. So, for instance, the fact that the extremely oppressive policy vis-a-vis national minorities has not met with a lot of resistance within China. That's a very telling signal. Even the model minority of the Mongols are now encountering problems they had not had in the past. And this second generation nationalities policy that Xi Jinping has been advocating is clearly a Han nationalist approach, and that will certainly shape the range of alternatives that you can expect from within the system. That I would indeed argue.
All right. So there's no, so let me put it that way, no current opportunity or urge to also for the EU to prepare for a post Xi Jinping China, or a post you know, more collective or more liberal, not in a political sense, but more rational in an economic sense, Chinese leadership. So I
would say there has been a kind of even an internal regime change. What used to be a communist aristocracy, where you had different power centers that had to negotiate and to agree between them, has been turned into an imperial command of one person or one center. And that changes the dynamic, and that also changes the range of options on which we could hope, I think.
Right, thank you very much, Reinhard. Alice, you have mentioned in the light of this, as we again now emphasized, fundamental challenge that China, the Chinese regime is posing to the EU, and then obviously for some time to continue to exist and that form, that cooperation with China should be very issue specific. So very focused, very concrete, lined up with specific definitions of fields. And there's a question from the audience here, and I kind of also to the audience, I will try to integrate your questions to what I have noted down and also what the panelists are saying. So keep putting your questions, and I would also encourage the panelists to keep your mics open and feel free to jump in, and it will also leave you more and more room to do so in the next 20 minutes. But Alice, yeah, there have been a question, and you mentioned that in your statement, we should be really specific when it comes to cooperating with China. And there's a question in terms of if the European is able to engage in cyber diplomacy the way that China is engaged with countries, for example, in Africa and other parts of Europe. This is one policy area this person here is interested in, and the other is intellectual property violations. To what extent, that's probably also a question to Helena then, is the EU willing and able to really follow up on this very issue-specific issue here? But let us kick it off, because that's also your field of expertise, Alice, a lot. Of course, cyber diplomacy. Is Europe able and willing to engage in countries in Africa in the way China does? Thank you.
It is, Christine, but certainly in different way that China is currently engaging. It's important to remind, and thanks for that question, that China is very active in Africa when it comes to cyber diplomacy, but when in general term, when it comes to the promotion of its technologies and its way of managing technologies in sub-Saharan Africa in particular. I'm thinking about training programs as well that are offered to African engineers, but also officials when it comes to managing so-called smart cities, when it comes to managing 4G, if not 5G network yet, when it comes to using and adapting smart port or smart airport and building a complex between cities and ports using Chinese technologies. I'm a bit developing, but I think it's important to take all this into account and to also take into account the fact that China can support this policy by the fact that in some countries, its technologies and companies are already well placed on the market and have a first mover advantage in this case. Regarding IPR, I will let Helena develop more specifically on the action, but what I can say is that clearly since January 2020, from the European Commission, there has been a clear acknowledgement also of the issue even before, but in January 2020 there was the publication of a report which ranked China as Europe priority 1 when it comes to IPR offense, and just I quote now the report that I found again: China is its territory Hong Kong deliver more than 80% of the counterfeit and pirated goods seized by EU customs authorities. So I mean, this is a major issue that is already well taken into account by policymakers. Just if I may, just a few lines on China's weaknesses or limits to follow up on Reinhardt's point, and also on diverging views on the current domestic and foreign policy orientation within China. In my opinion, and based on also atmosphere that we could see before COVID-19, and probably this analysis has to be updated based on latest exchanges, but intra-party resentment is strong against Xi Jinping, because senior party cadres have been addressed or considered like children. Basically, they have to repeat Xi Jinping's keywords. They have to self-criticize in front of colleagues. They are ranked. They have to attend a campaign in the summer in the countryside. So, I mean, and all this general atmosphere has generated resentment in part of the party elite, but it has not led to an expression of this resentment. I mean, a public expression of this resentment, given the risk that this expression would, of course, generate. So, but I wouldn't bet on party instability in the coming years, because I think Xi Jinping has reinforced its level of control to such a point, especially by restructuring of key security and justice institutions recently, that I mean, and this is still rather strong political system, but this is another topic. One point I would like to underline when we mention China's challenges is, of course, there is demographic challenges, but there is also the food security challenge that has been raised more explicitly during COVID-19. It's addressed by the Chinese authority, but I think it's important to take into account that China is dependent on some agricultural products on its import. And of course, the third point that have to be followed is the overall evolution of the Chinese economy. Figures seems to be positive, but it's hard to double check. And of course, this will have an impact on China's ability to promote its interest based on the evolution of its economy.
Thank you, Alice. Internal challenges of China, and also you covered the previous question on issue-specific cooperation. Helena, would you like to add something to how does Europe currently stand with IPR, or what is your view, your hopes on this IPR protection? Then there's also a related question when it comes to quality insurance. It's slightly different, but you could either take them together or pick one of those issue-specific relations with China. Thank you.
Thanks, Christine. And indeed, good questions. And it could have been one of the issues I should have mentioned in the beginning when it comes to actually areas where we need to cooperate with China. Because, of course, one part is making sure that fake goods or IPI infringed articles don't enter into Europe. And that's something we have to deal with internally. But I think we need the cooperation of China to really tackle the issue. And I think it's actually a long-standing policy we have in cooperating with China on IP issues. And I think it's fair to say that we've seen improvement, we've seen legislative improvement. Enforcement obviously is a huge issue, but it's also there we've seen improvement. So I think we have to gonna continue and work together on these, on the whole IP enforcement above all. Part of that is, of course, to be very open of what we find, whether it's IP infringed goods entering, whether it's quality issues, it's a prolongation. But I think again, the best result will come from us working together, China acknowledging where the issues are, which is very often the case, and then trying to address it also when it comes to enforcement. I wanted to actually comment on something on Africa also, or engaging with Africa, where I think that's one of the areas where we are currently looking very closely, if I put it that way, getting our own house in order and getting our own instruments in order. Because of course, what we are seeing from China is very much a loan-driven campaign also when it comes to African countries, with its shortcomings when it comes to indebtedness. But I think also on the EU side, we do have a number of instruments where we can supply loans, notably through the EIB. We have a huge envelope on development cooperation. And if we add that EU and member states together, it is actually a substantial amount of money. So I think it's really adding to the dialogues we have and the reasons why we want changes in regulatory aspects, actually normally because it's good for the country in question. We need actually to be more efficient in the way we give our support out also, and make financing available under the right conditions to the African countries. So that is a debate which I think has started now, with very much under the heading Team Europe. But I think that is something where we're going to have to be a lot better and a lot better coordinated as we go forward.
Could I come in here with a sentence, Christine?
Please.
I just wanted to pick up what has been said by Helena and point to the fact that the EU has a connectivity policy that so far is restricted just to the Eurasian arc between Europe and Asia. But we should expand the scope of that strategy and include Africa. And that means sort of developing a new understanding of the cooperation. So far, this has been driven as development cooperation, but we have to inject also a sense of geoeconomic and geopolitical rationale into our cooperation. So African leg of the EU connectivity strategy would, I think, be an adequate answer to what we see emanating there.
That's a great idea and a great topic, which we also could actually pose to the second panel, because they're going to dive much deeper into the EU also connectivity strategy that you've just mentioned, Rainer. But overall, I think it has become clear that Africa is for Europe an important field beyond issue-specific kind of policies to engage with, also in regard to what China obviously does in Africa and what it offers, which sometimes the EU offers less or not in frameworks which are digestible for African partners. Yeah, that's a very valid point, and also touches upon something, and I would like to bring Martin in here also for another question, following up on what we've just discussed, how the EU could kind of restructure or innovate in that sense its own models or mechanisms or dynamics when it comes to engagement with Africa, but also in managing our relations with China. Martin, the experience, what is the experience or the learning, the lessons learned, so to say, that in the shift that you have described in Eastern Europe with the 16 and 17+1 experience, in the sense of how to relate this to the overall European or EU strategy in dealing with China. I mean, there's also have been some discussion about, I think rightly so, that Eastern and Central European countries were complaining they were not given so much face time as the big European players when it comes to dealing with China. They felt kind of second class, you know, in that sense, when the EU and then often the bigger players would discuss how to deal with China. So what is your lessons learned? What is the experience from that shift, this whole procedure and the way it led to a changing perception in Central Europe that the EU could take into account when dealing with China? Thank you.
Thanks. That's a great question. Well, I think the very existence of the 16 or 17+1 initiative, you know, needs to be put into proper context. And first of all, we have to realize that this is an initiative that preceded Xi Jinping. So, you know, it was created in 2012. And at that point, you could still have a lot of sort of wishful thinking about the way you would expect the PRC to proceed. There was a certain naivete in the expectations that were in Eastern Europe at that time. There was a certain disillusionment with the West after the financial and euro crises of 2008. So all these elements played together in the creation of the 16 or 17+1. It was driven by what is called in Eastern Europe economic diplomacy. This economic diplomacy largely failed because the benefits that were expected to come from 16+1, 17+1 never really materialized. So now we're again going through a process of, let's say, partial disillusionment in Eastern Europe. People see that the initiative didn't bring what it was supposed to bring, and it actually created a lot of trouble in the intra-European relationships. It's becoming quite obvious that the initiative is not looked upon kindly in Brussels and other European capitals. So I would say that right now Eastern Europe is in the process of re-evaluating the wisdom of joining this initiative. But of course, you know, this is one of the initiatives that are much easier to join than to leave, especially if it were up to individual countries to leave them. And any individual countries that would leave such an initiative would, of course, immediately invite the wrath of the whole system in China. So at the same time, the mechanism within 16+1, the decision-making mechanism and the structure of the whole organization is made in such a way that it basically excludes coordination between and among the East European countries. It's a very Beijing-centric initiative. The whole secretariat, the whole apparatus sits in Beijing at Malta, and at the national level, you only have the national implementers without any support mechanisms. So there is a disillusionment, but there isn't much at this very moment that can be done about it in Eastern Europe as it is.
Thank you very much, Martin, for bringing this experience or this lessons learned in that sense, this challenges to the discussion. And there again, questions following up on what we've just discussed also, and that relates to that actually, the way that, and that's a question I guess to all of you, and please feel free, whoever would like to go first. In what way the EU or Europe or the US, the institution obviously representing Europe to some extent, is willing, like the US and China, to take on a truly global leadership role, if they are willing and able to unite themselves? And in what way would that differ, or should that differ also from the way China is, for example, again, taking Africa as an example here by the audience, the way the Europe would project its power or its ambition, if there is one or there should be one, for global leadership? So again, to rephrase, to clarify my questions, kind of accumulated from the audience questions to all of you. the specific European capacity and nature of a truly global leadership role, also in comparison to China and the US? Big question, but yeah, obviously a question which many in the audience feel it's time to address. Who would like to go first? Helena.
Could I come in on this one? I think yes is the answer. We would like to have a bigger global leadership together with China and US, again, because we're the three biggest economies in that sense. So obviously, I think whatever we would do whatever we are doing when we actually try to lead is based on our own experience in the EU, which actually bringing countries together to forge a joint way forward. So I think that whatever we do, that will come into us as leaders, because we know that it's possible, and I think there's a genuine feeling that the system works better if you all come together. I think one thing which is not really linked to this, but it's just a point which I've been thinking about because it came up in a number of interventions, and that is we have to be a lot better to share analysis, share information among member states, because China, and as was pointed out, 16+1 predated Xi Jinping. Actually, almost every policy we see now, the MIC 2025, Made in China 2025, predated Xi Jinping also. It was just called something else 10 years ago or 15 years ago. So I think we have to share again what we see as tendencies moving forward, and they're coming out with a joint and much better research, let's put it that, position on how we tackle things. I think one good example is the exchanges we're doing on investment screening. Again, it is a narrow field, but de facto, we are sharing information. And just by doing that, we get to know a lot more of the whole picture. So just an additional comment to something which was raised before.
Thanks a lot. Anybody else of the panelists would like to add to that specific European nature of global leadership in comparison to the US and China? And also in that tension, there's an additional question here. Looking at Africa, the obvious tension that Europe there has been a colonial power and would potentially be perceived as being too, impactful or too normatively guiding policies there. But on the other hand, China obviously taking a very pragmatic approach. So in terms of global leadership, setting a specific European role, what would be your take or your vision for a European global leadership role?
I would be reluctant to go too fast for that term, European leadership. I mean, look at what Trump has done. He has a more united government as his disposal than anybody would have around Europe. We would find it much more difficult to agree on a strategy, as the whole history of the Union proves. And he has not been extremely successful. He's been confrontational and bumbling, but not utterly successful. None of the issues regarding the level playing field that motivated his trade war with the Chinese have been resolved. We're now negotiating within our CAI negotiations about the same issues, and we're trying to make more progress than the Americans have and find it extremely difficult. And even if we get anything on the paper, the problem will still remain. Will the Chinese honor their language this time more than they did with the WTO? So I think there is a certain arrogance vis-a-vis the US within Europe. We always tend to believe that we could do much better than them, but I'm not so convinced of that. So I would rather define the European role as a facilitator. And that would include facilitating also an environment in which other countries beyond the EU, US, China triangle that also want to have advocacy can play a role. Facilitating a cooperation, that is what I think could be our leadership, if you want. And of course, there are specific areas where Europe has been leading, for instance, on industrial norming and standardization. We have played above our weight within ISO and other international norming institutions. So there, Europe could also play a leadership role, but I wouldn't overblow it.
Thank you, Reinhard. Very clear words. I think Alice, you want to come in? Or sorry, your hand.
Yes, when talking about global leadership, we could talk about activism in key multilateral organizations, etc. But more specifically, I see two areas which will be key areas of competition for global leadership already now and in the coming years. One is a financial area, and second is technological area. Financial area, we have been talking for many years about power of the euro, leverage that the euro could bring to the EU as well. But now the emerging topic is blockchain and cryptocurrency. And China is trying to position itself on this market. And if we don't have a clear-cut policy on cryptocurrency that is designed and supported, I think there will be a very tough competition in the field. And a second one is related to the previous one, is a technological competition, but taking into account not just 5G, which I think is really the tip of the iceberg, but not just technology per se, the infrastructure, but the use and the implementation in an urban environment. So basically compatible security technologies. By definition, as democracies, we are moving away from all this surveillance system that scare us, and this is logical, but how to invest in it so to make it fully compatible with protection of individual data, of course GDPR, etc. I'm saying this at a time where there is really competition on this smart city ecosystem, and China is investing very rapidly. I think there is a role for the EU to play here, but very, very concretely, not just on its territory, but also as an export of technology and ecosystem of technologies as well.
Thank you very much, Alice. Also, Martin, yeah, please add. If you can.
Thanks. Well, I would just say that political leadership requires certain will to power, and I don't see much of that, in Europe, which is probably a good thing. I see a lot of that in China, and all Leninist systems ultimately are about concentrated power, and we have seen in Xi Jinping's new era, an extreme concentration of power, and it's considered in that particular environment to be a positive development for specific historical reasons because of the the changing global order and the opportunities that are now supposedly given to the Communist Party of China and the PRC because of their mastery of certain technologies. So there are certain things where I think Europe can't really compete with the People's Republic of China, and probably not even with the United States. And one of them is political leadership. Europe is probably not quite ready for it. But there are other forms of leadership. And I think there's a huge potential in Europe to be the leader in values, especially in openness and democracy, and present itself for what it is, like a global leader in essentially open society. Thanks.
Thank you very much, Martin. Also, I mean, you all have made it very clear that leadership role, yes, but as a facilitator, maybe in some areas, as Alice has mentioned, technology, standard setting, also now you, Martin, mentioning values, but also with a modesty or with a reflective moment and not overstretching or overdoing it like the US has been doing. There is obviously a huge interest also in the audience, and I would probably take this as the final question before I would like to invite all of you for a one-sentence closing statement, and I would let you know in a bit what the question would be. the question of how will or can the US election influence the China policy of, or the China strategy of the EU in the future? Well, obvious question, big question, but as you all mentioned, Europe has to take in the US as one of the partners to cooperate, and also China. So how can and will the US elections influence EU's China policy? Who would like to take that one?
Okay, I will start then. I would say that the need for transatlantic dialogue and coordination is a given regardless of who would be elected president in November. And it's been a very positive move on the part of the HRVP Borrell to propose a transatlantic dialogue on China to the present US administration. And that was started last Friday, and they will have the first substantial exchange in November still. I believe that our own interests and our own values force us to cooperate. And even if Trump would be reelected, which I hope will not happen, but even if that became the case, we could not relent from the effort of trying to find common ground with the United States and other players, of course, also. So I would not make the European-China policy a variable of what happens in the US. It should be defined by our own interests and values.
Thank you, Reinhard. Anybody would like to add to this at that point in time?
I think I very much agree with Reinhard on this one. I think our own strategy needs to be, the basis will not change for our strategy. What may change is actually how we adopt it. And there I agree 100%. We need to work together with the US. We need to work together with other partners and somehow get commonalities and get China to actually address those issues that influence too much or creates too much havoc on the global market.
Thanks a lot, Helena. For the sake of time, as we're approaching the end of the panel, I would invite all of you, the four of you, and I would challenge you to really stick to one sentence. You have the full attention of the audience, of all of us again. What would be that one key takeaway sentence or your message you would leave with us now, all of us venturing into the break? That one statement, that one question you would like to, again, emphasize also after being involved in the discussion. And I would call on Helena first. And if you could, one sentence, really challenge you on that one. But yeah, please, okay, if you would like to take this up.
Thanks, Christine. I think it's a call to EU, all of us, is to stick together and don't be naive.
Thanks a lot, Helena. Reinhard, your key takeaway message, one sentence for all of us.
Expect Xi Jinping's China to be with us in the medium term, and don't expect that because there is internal opposition, this regime will go away. There has always been opposition against Stalin, and he's still slugged it out for quite a while.
Thank you. Like Helena, a call to a good wake-up call, reminder for all of us. Thank you, Reinhard. Alice, your one sentence takeaway.
Yeah, the key word is long-term. It's a long-term competition that has emerged between political system, technologies, economic system that is currently unfolding, and it's just the beginning.
Thank you very much. Excellent. And Martin, your final one sentence takeaway message for all of us, please.
Final words. I think we have lost 20 years of rather naive and an approach to China that has been built on wrong assumptions. And we now urgently need to develop a more realistic framework.
Thanks a lot. Wow, a lot of European unity here on that panel, I have to say, with that final question. Having said that, thanks a lot for your discipline, for your knowledge, for your expertise, to all of the panelists, Helena, Alice, Reinhard, and Martin. Thanks to the audience for your excellent questions. I'm sorry we didn't cover them all, but I hopefully tried to bring them in. I think we all deserve a break. Has been a stimulating discussion, a lot more to discover. And I have been informed that we would return, and Dietmar and others, please come in if that's not correct, but we will continue at 10:45. So quarter to the hour, 10:45, we will continue with the second panel. Thanks a lot again to the panelists first and foremost, and have a good break and see you back soon.